A lot of that pattern of those patterns related to water. It's typically a pattern of a life and or death, and usually both in a specific way. And then, of course, you have all of these flood myths. And by the way, the flood is the same pattern, symbolic pattern, as baptism and as crossing the river oftentimes, right? And this is something that we're going to get into more later. But the crossing of the river pattern, you see this in all sorts of legends and stories and myths, and it's a really cool pattern. Where in Saint Christopher's crossing of the river, you see this pattern where the hero crosses the river, the hero or heroes cross the river. And on the other side is the promised land, or is the kingdom of heaven, or is the ascension, like Elijah crossing over the river. I want to say the Jordan, I believe it was, and then he's taken up into heaven. He ascends into heaven on this fiery chariot. You have Joshua and the Israelites crossing the river to get into the promised land, the land flowing with milk and honey, right? Which is a metaphor of heaven. Kingdom of heaven. The river has to do with purification in part. It has to do with boundaries. In ancient times, the rivers were often used as boundaries to territories. And so it's this natural in between one realm and another. And it naturally has to do with purification because, that's where you bathe. You bathe in the water, in the river. And it also is naturally related to death and chaos because of the dynamic and violent, oftentimes, nature of a rushing river, a raging, overflowing river, right? So you easily drown in that sort of river and or capsize or whatever. And so there's this sense in the pattern of baptism where you wade into the water and you are dunked down into chaos and death, and then are pulled back up into new life. That's the kind of the idea behind Christian baptism. So it has to do again with afterlife and the underworld. Of course, we have the river Styx in Greek mythology. We have the crossing of the river with the Israelites crossing over into the promised land, or into the kingdom of heaven, essentially. We have the burning rainbow bridge called Bifrost, which basically brings you across a great river of chaos to Asgard, the realm of the gods. And just to give you a little bit of background here, the reason why I want to create this video is because I have this really long form piece of content or video that is about baptism. It's about the symbolism of water. It's got a lot of that pattern, of those patterns related to water in it. And it can be a little bit difficult perhaps to understand without having a good foundation of what water typically symbolizes. It's typically a pattern of a life and or death, and usually both in a specific way. So what I'm going to try to do is use a story from the Bible, from the life of Moses and the Israelites, to show how this pattern works. I think if we start with the most tangible item and scale our way up might be helpful. Let's start with geese. Every winter, bar none, the geese will fly south. It's an easy pattern to recognize. We all see it. We all know that it exists. Every spring, without fail, the fish spawn. Bass will move into pre-spawn early in the season, early in spring, and then into the spawning phase later in the spring. And then post-spawn, usually late spring, early summer, something like that. And their behavior is unique to the phase that they're in, right? They're super aggressive and opportunistic, very ravenous is a good word for it in pre-spawn, when they're trying to fatten up and gain the strength and energy they need for the spawning season. And they're not hungry exactly, but very aggressive during the spawn as they guard their nests. These patterns are a little bit more difficult to discern because they're beneath the surface of the water. They belong to an invisible realm to the naked eye. But if you know your seasons if you know the signs, if you know your temperatures and weather, etc., you'll know precisely what the fish are doing and where they are beneath the surface and what they're eating and what their behavior is. You'll know what they're doing. So that's another pattern for us. And you can apply the same idea to the metaphysical world around us. We're all swimming in this ocean of archetypal patterns and metaphysical symbols. And sometimes they're difficult to perceive. But if you know what to look for, you can detect them and predict them and even use them in your favor as consistently as any other pattern in reality. Just like the pattern of the fish and of the geese and of humans for that matter. Right? There's a reason why there are many more crimes during a full moon than any other day. It's something like the identity or essence of the moon wielding influence over humans in the same way that it influences the tides of the ocean, the sap in plants, and the activity of animals, right? Now, that sounds like superstition. It sounds like nonsense. But if you look into it, you'll see what I'm saying, right? Statistically, this is sound. It's not hocus pocus. They're simply patterns that we can recognize and use to our advantage. So, for example, I love fishing during that phase of the moon, the full moon. I tend to catch more fish, and many other anglers agree with me. And it's not to say that that's the only pattern, right? The other patterns have to align as well. Like you still need to have good weather, good temperature. Like if you're trying to, let's say you're trying to fly fish for carp during spawn, not the easiest thing to do for most, even with a full moon. But if those patterns all come together, it'll work out for you. Okay, now let's move on to a pattern that's even more difficult to detect. It still belongs to the world of matter, but it's a little bit more invisible, and you'll see what I mean. So in the first sweaty t-shirt experiment, they had 49 women and 44 men, and they gave the men clean t-shirts to wear for 2 nights, and then without deodorant or anything, and then returned to the scientists. Then they had the women come in and one at a time sniff the shirts and describe each odor, the intensity, pleasantness, and sexiness. And the results were pretty overwhelming. The women preferred the scent, generally reported a sexiness and a preference for the t-shirts worn by men whose MHC genes were different from their own. And there have been many other similar experiments since then, right? All reporting very similar things. One experiment, for example, found that heterosexual women can actually smell which suitors are available and which are taken. It has something to do with the chemicals, the natural pheromones that our bodies release and give off. It's pretty amazing, right? To be able to discern these invisible patterns of a man's genes through smell alone, it's pretty fascinating. Think of it this way. Imagine you have a friend, and this friend says, it's going to sound a little bit crazy, but I think I can tell whether or not a man's a good physical match for me by the way he smells. Is that weird? You don't know anything about these tests, or these experiments haven't taken place yet. You're going to think that person's a little bit crazy. But the reality is she would be right. And I think that's precisely what's happening with scientifically minded people and atheists, for example. When they hear religious people talk, when they hear spiritual people talk, they hear language like angel and demon or God and Satan, and they're done. They're out. To them, those people are crazy people. But the reality is, when people talk about those things, they're describing invisible patterns that actually exist in the world and are an essential part of it, by the way, right? These agencies, archetypal patterns, identity, essences, agencies. There's a number of different ways to talk about this, and it's difficult, right? These things do, however, exist in the metaphysical world around us, and not like the Marvel comic book world of superheroes. or something like that, right? These aren't material things or beings. This is the metaphysical world that we're talking about. Okay, so let's consider another metaphysical pattern, or a metaphysical pattern, excuse me. One of the many patterns of love. The pattern of Eros, the archetype of the Cupid, this Cupid being as old as time, right? And as predictable as any other pattern out there. But this is metaphysics that we're talking about, right? When I tell you that my friend was struck by Cupid's arrow, I'm not talking about some physical being in a parallel universe or something, or like materializing like an extraterrestrial into our reality and unloading a bunch of crazy arrows into my friend and making her fall into love. I'm talking about one of the many versions of love, right? And in the same way that I can talk about Cupid or an ancient Greek philosopher can, without the risk of sounding crazy, we should be able to talk about the other archetypal forces and patterns in the world using the best symbols and visuals and ways of describing these things that we have access to. In Matthew, Jesus said something very interesting. He said, "When evening comes, you say, the weather will be fair, for the sky is red. And in the morning, today it will be stormy, for the sky is red and overcast." You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but not the signs of the times. Right. And so what he's getting ticked off about here is the fact that they had the ability to look at the weather and look at the phase of the moon and all of this stuff. They could see the patterns in nature and even predict the future using that information. But they weren't able to detect the patterns in the metaphysical world around them. The signs of the times, that word, that Greek word we translate into signs, was the same word that you would use to describe like a miracle or the signs in the heavens, as in an astrological sort of sense. That it was used that way as well. So what he's talking about there is patterns, right? The archetypal patterns, the archetypal forces in the world, in this symbolic world that we live in. He's saying this is important. You need to be able to understand these things, to detect these things, to discern these things, right? And I want to kind of get into why it's so important. And I have a couple of examples. When I was a kid, I loved fishing. It was one of the things that I did with my dad. It's how we bonded, and I loved it. And we were bait fishermen, right? So we would fish with worms. Basically, we would go hunting for night crawlers at night. We'd catch a bunch of them, put them in a bucket. Next morning, we go out and go fishing. And mainly, what we would catch were panfish like sunfish and bluegill. But I remember when I was probably 7 or 8, I would watch the big kids. They would catch big fish, like really big fish to me at the time, right? They're probably like 16 to 20 inch bass. But they were huge to me because all I caught was these little panfish. And so one day I got up the nerve to go over and talk to one of these big kids. I said, "Wow, that's really big fish." And, I'm this cute little kid. And he says, "You want to hold it?" I said, "Yeah." Lets me hold the fish. And I ask him, "How did you catch him? What did you use?" And he says, "Well, I used a crayfish pattern," or something like that. I don't think it was a pattern. He wasn't fly fishing, but it was a jig is what it was. It was something like that. And so I said, "Oh, can I see it?" And he showed me the jig. Next week, whatever it was, I went out and I used my allowance, or maybe I got my dad to help me. I can't remember, but I ended up getting these jigs, the same types of jigs. And it took me a long time to recognize the pattern. Like I had to observe the crayfish in their natural habitat and figure out how they would swim, how they would run away from a bass. Right. And that was pretty easy because I like to wade in the water and try to catch crayfish. But anyways, the long and short of it is, to fish properly with a jig, right? If you're imitating a crayfish, you cast it out there, you let it sink to the bottom, and you just kind of jerk it a couple times. Jerk it a few more times. And it looks in the water, it looks like a crayfish fleeing from a bass. And so eventually I figured that pattern out. Right? Both the pattern of what the crayfish looks like in the water and how it swims and how it presents in the water, and also the pattern beneath the surface of when the bass would show up and when they would feed. This was pre-spawn, is what I later found out. I didn't know at the time. But anyways, long story short, I started catching those big fish, and it was one of the proudest moments of my life as a kid, especially. It was one of what it was. It was one of the puzzle pieces that it was one of the puzzle pieces of becoming a man, of becoming an independent human being, because this was something that my father didn't know how to do. I figured this out on my own. I was very proud of that. It was very exciting. It was exhilarating. So anyways, that's just one example of a pattern in reality that I was able to recognize and take advantage of. And I was able to upgrade from panfish to these giant bass, right? Really big bass, to me at the time, at very least. And the same thing applies to so many different areas of our life, right? There are patterns of reality, invisible patterns in the world of relationships, in the world of, if you're a young man, for example, and you want to attract a good mate, what do you have to do? You have to figure out the patterns between a man and a woman, the patterns, okay, what happens? How is it that a woman is attracted to a man? What are the things that I need to do? What are the things I need to say? How do I need to dress? What do I need to look like? There's all these different things. You're going to recognize these patterns. You're going to see, oh, that guy who's really fit and is very confident and, acts this certain way is able to, the women seem to flock to this man. So I need to be more like that guy. These sorts of things. Anyways, here's another quick example. When I was young, again, this is another pattern from my youth. When I was very young, my parents were very poor. We were a very poor family, and it was a source of stress for everyone. All right, they tried to keep it under wraps, but I could hear them talk about the financial situation, and it wasn't good. And I would see the bills come in from Fannie Mae, and I hated Fannie Mae because I knew the stress that put on my family. And I also was able to make this connection, right, from something that I read in the Bible, which said something like the debtor is enslaved to the lender, right? So when you take on debt, you become enslaved in some sense. And as I grew older, I started to recognize this pattern more and more and more. I started seeing, the cycle of consumerism in the world. And, these are the types of things that have been, they're basically a dead horse that's being beaten over and over again. I understand that it's become cliche at this point, but it's still incredibly important. And it's something that I recognized when I was young. And so I decided I wanted to live a debt-free life. And I did that to the best of my ability. And I saved up a bunch of money when I was in the Marine Corps, and I bought a house for cash, and I bought my car with cash, and I stayed out of debt for the most part. Right, I have the lowest debt ratio you can imagine. I have a little bit, but it's like basically nothing. I do it for the credit more than anything. And the reason I was able to stay out of debt and live in the way that I do now, which is great. There's pros and cons to it, right? Because I live in an incredibly humble home, right? I'm not saying I'm an incredibly humble person. I'm just saying I live in a very humble home in a humble neighborhood, right? Well below my means. And I like it that way. I prefer it that way. But, there are cons to it too, right? If you're a vain person like I happen to be, sometimes it doesn't feel great to live more humbly than you feel like you should. Anyways, that's a whole nother story. But if I hadn't been able to discern that pattern in reality, I would have jumped off the same cliff that I saw so many other people jumping off of around me. That's just a couple of examples of why patterns are so important in our lives. Now, as time goes on, as I create these videos, I'm going to be creating a lot more videos related to archetypal patterns in reality and symbolism in the world, because I'm seeing how incredibly important it has been in my life, and I think it can be a huge help, right? Both in your process of individuation and shadow work and all of that, but also just in your life as a whole. Gosh, there's just so many benefits. talking about winning friends and influencing people, persuasion, in the same way that you can chum a fishing hole, right? You can chum a certain area at a certain time of the day every single day, and the fish are constantly coming and eating at that certain time. You're influencing their pattern of feeding. In fact, you're creating an entirely new pattern by doing that. The same way that you could do that, and it's so much easier to catch fish when you do that. And the same pattern you can apply to hunting. But in the same way that you could do that, you can encourage certain patterns of behavior in other people. An example of which would be something like invoking the law of reciprocity, if you know anything about that. Now, there's a healthy way to do this and an unhealthy way, of course. Like in my relationship with my wife, if I say I rub her back every night for a week straight, because I know that it's going to be good for our relationship, and because I also know that increases the chances of her doing nice things to me, that's not necessarily a bad thing. There's a fine line, obviously. Patterns can help you predict the future, literally, right? I'm not talking about like some woo nonsense. I'm not talking about, hocus pocus. I'm not talking about tarot cards or fortune telling. What I'm talking about is patterns that happen. Every pattern that I can think of is predictable. It's cyclical in nature. It happens over and over and over again, right? So every archetype that exists that wields this crazy amount of influence over human behavior, it's as ancient as time itself. They're as ancient as time itself. They show up over and over and over again in legends and mythology and tales and fairy tales and scriptures. And that's for a reason, right? Because there's cyclical patterns that happen over and over and over again, or they create cyclical patterns that happen over and over again. And when you're able to detect those patterns, when you're able to discern them, you're able to predict in some real sense what's going to happen. And I mean, that's incredibly obvious when you were just talking about the world of matter, right? It gets a little bit more complex and a little bit more difficult to explain and understand when we're talking about the world of metaphysics. But when we're talking about the physical world, it's obvious, right? Like I can go to a body of water any time of the year, and well, I'm not as good in the winter, but most times of the year, and I can tell you exactly where the game fish are. I can tell you at what depth they are. I can tell you what they're doing. I can tell you what they're eating. And I can do that because I can recognize patterns on the water, right? And this is what any fisherman who's been doing this for a long time has the ability to do. This doesn't make me special, it just makes me a good fisherman, right? And I do that by taking into account the pattern of the wind, for example, right? There's a saying, wind from the east, you'll catch the least. Wind from the west, fishing's best. Wind from the north, fish will come forth. That pattern generally works pretty well, but you do have to pair it with other patterns, right? If the other patterns are bad, like say, for example, the waves are washing away, are going toward the other side of the lake, fishing's probably not going to be good in that spot. You need to go to the other side of the lake. And the reason for that is probably very scientific. It has something to do with, I think, the phytoplankton being pushed by the wind to the other side of the lake, and the panfish, the smaller fish, following the plankton to eat them. And of course, the bigger fish following the little fish to eat them. And then me following the big fish to catch the big fish and eat them. What else? Of course, the time of the day is huge, right? The fish are going to bite more in the morning and in the evening, right, as the sun starts setting. There's just a billion and one different patterns. The patterns on the surface of the water itself, right? I can see a ripple in the water, so like a little swirl. There's various different patterns on the surface of the water that tell you exactly what a fish is doing in the water, right? I can see a certain type of swirl. Maybe I see just a tip of a fin, and I could tell you, oh, that's a carp spawning. Or I see a different type of swirl, a different type of ripple in the water, and I can say, oh, that's a trout rising, or that's a smallmouth bass. And yeah, there's a lot of pattern recognition that goes on in the world of fishing like that. And that's pretty easy to understand. But then you have the world of metaphysics, right? The metaphysical world. And that's where it gets difficult. And that's when you start talking about things like the logos. What is the logos? That's when you start talking about things like God, like archetypes. It's a little bit more difficult, but it's every bit as real, and it's even more important. So I just wanted to say that before we jump into this. As I go through this story, keep in mind, just to give you an example, when you're shopping for a new car, right? Let's say you want to buy a Honda Accord, and you've decided you want a new Honda Accord. And so you go to a dealership, you go to dealership after dealership trying to find this Honda Accord. What's inevitably going to happen is, and you've probably had this happen to you, you're going to start seeing a lot more Honda Accords on the road, right? It's inevitable. And the reason for that is because you've devoted your attention to the Accord, right? And that unlocks the Accord in your mind. I don't know how else to put it. Like it literally lifts the veil off of all of these thousands of Honda Accords that you were seeing before, but you weren't seeing them, right? Because the mind can only handle so much information, of course, right? We have this vast multiplicity of information at hand. Like right now, there's way too much information for me to focus on in this room. I'm only going to see the parts that my mind determines as important. And that's precisely what happens with this Honda Accord story. You start seeing them over and over and over again on the road. And this happens with all sorts of things. And it happens the most with the things that you devote the most attention to, especially the things that you devote the most attention to early in the morning, as soon as you get up, and right before you go to sleep, by the way. That's when your unconscious mind is the most impressionable. But of course, quantity is a huge part of it, right? The more you focus on something, right, whether that, let's just say it's a particular archetype. So the more you focus on a particular archetypal spirit, let's call it the warrior, let's say the warrior, you want to be a great warrior, right? You're in the military, you're a soldier or a Marine or whatever. You want to become a great warrior. And so you're focusing on that archetype. You're going to start seeing that pattern everywhere in your life, right? And everything that naturally flows from that particular archetype is going to start flowing into your life, right? Because you are focusing on it so heavily, you're obsessing over it. And this is why it's so incredibly important to focus on the highest thing that you can conceptualize, which is the logos. Now, water in general, there's a reason why virtually every creation story that you can think of has water as a key foundational element, right? In ancient Mesopotamian mythology, for example, the god Enki emerges from the primordial waters of chaos, essentially to bring order and civilization to the world. In Egyptian mythology, Atum created himself out of the primeval waters of chaos, which were called Nun. And of course, in the Bible, the spirit hovers and broods, or something like this, above the primordial waters of chaos in the beginning, to ultimately create the entirety of the universe, right? That's what preceded that event. And then, of course, you have all of these flood myths. And by the way, the flood is the same symbolic pattern of that as baptism and as crossing the river oftentimes, right? And this is something that we're going to get into more later. But the crossing of the river pattern, you see this in all sorts of legends and stories and myths. And it's a really cool pattern where in St. Christopher, excuse me, St. Christopher's crossing of the river, you see this pattern where the hero crosses the river, the hero or heroes cross the river, and on the other side is the promised land, or is the kingdom of heaven, or is the ascension, like Elijah crossing over the river. I want to say the Jordan, I believe it was, and then he's taken up into heaven. He ascends into heaven on this fiery chariot. You have Joshua and the Israelites crossing the river to get into the promised land, the land flowing with milk and honey, right? Which is a metaphor of heaven, the kingdom of heaven. Excuse me. And so it's a really interesting symbol. I don't want to go into too much depth on it now, and I don't want to spend too much time on it. But the crossing of the river has to do with purification in part. It has to do with boundaries. In ancient times, the rivers were often used as boundaries to territories. And so it's this natural in between in between one realm and another, and it naturally has to do with purification because that's where you bathe. You bathe in the water in the river, and it also is naturally related to death and chaos because of the dynamic and violent, oftentimes, nature of a rushing river, a raging, overflowing river. Right, so you easily drown in that sort of river, and or capsize or whatever. And so there's this sense in the pattern of baptism where you wade into the water and you are dunked down into chaos and death, and then are pulled back up into new life. That's the kind of the idea behind Christian baptism. So has to do again with afterlife and the underworld. Of course, we have the river Styx in Greek mythology. We have the crossing of the river with the Israelites crossing over into the promised land or into the kingdom of heaven, essentially. We have the burning rainbow bridge called Bifrost, Bilrost. Bilrost, however you say that, in Norse mythology, which basically brings you across a great river of chaos to Asgard, the realm of the gods. Okay, so let's get to this pattern, the pattern of water, the most important pattern of water, I believe. Um, it's basically the symbolism of the archetypal spirit called the Pneuma in the scriptures. Or it's also called the Geist. It's called the spirit in English, of course, right? Which always follows the logos. And the pattern is something like this. You're in the wilderness. You're in the desert. You may be in the darkest of nights. But if you're aiming at the highest, if you're aiming at the logos, inevitably the logos is going to start popping up all over the place as the eyes of your heart are opened. And what always follows is the spirit, the life-giving, nourishing spirit. So let's say you're running away from your addictions or your vices or your passions, right? Using religious language. What helps you escape? So, like the Israelites running away from the Egyptians, which is representative of the world of passions and missing the mark, of the world of the old gods, the pagan gods. They're running away from those passions. And what helps them escape is the Red Sea, essentially. Of course, the Spirit of God working with Moses and the rod. So Moses strikes the primordial waters of chaos with the rod, which represents the order and stability of faith in the logos, right? And aiming at this logos, a belief, right? And the waters part and they cross over on dry land. And once they get to the other side, now, of course, the Egyptians follow after them. They're trying to annihilate them. Pharaoh and the army of the Egyptians follow. But once the Israelites get to the other side, the waters close in and crush and drown the Egyptians, who are, again, representative of the lower passions and vices. So in this way, we see the waters being symbolic of, yes, the primordial waters of chaos and potentiality and multiplicity, but also of the spirit, right? Which is, and the waters are life-giving in one sense, but death dealing in another sense. And that's precisely what we see over and over again in the scriptures, is this pneuma, this spirit is life-giving in many contexts, but also death dealing in many others. Okay, so then you're wandering about in the desert. Or you're being guided, actually, right? Because you're aiming at the logos again. You're aiming at God, at the highest. And it's represented in this story by a cloud, right, which becomes a pillar of fire at night, guiding them and giving them light, and a pillar of, I believe, like a mist, a cooling mist in the heat of the sun. But you've been wandering for a while and you're getting tired, you're exhausted, and you're thirsty. But again, you're aiming at that cloud, which represents the highest. So what's inevitably going to happen? something, the things that naturally flow from that thing, whatever that thing precisely is, that thing or being that sits at the top of the hierarchy, whatever naturally flows from that is what's going to start flowing into your life naturally. That's just how it works. And in this case, it's water, again, representative of the spirit and the things of the spirit. But it's bitter, it's undrinkable to them. And what St. Gregory of Nyssa says about this is that this represents essentially the things of God, the things of the highest. They're going to be unpalatable at first, right? You just got out of not the desert. You just got out of the land of the strange, of the land of passions and lower, baser desires. So naturally, the highest things aren't going to be palatable to you right off the bat necessarily. Right? They're going to be bitter. They're not going to taste right. It's going to be weird. But you're aimed at the logos, which is represented in this story by the wood that they throw into the water, into the bitter water. That's the wood representing the Christ, the tree that he hung on. And what happens is the water, of course, becomes sweet and they can drink it. It becomes nourishing, life-giving. So the pattern is, if you're aimed at the highest, again, at the logos, you will inevitably find it. And you will go through dark times. You will go through your darkest part of the forest, through the wilderness. Inevitably in life. But if you aim properly, if you aim at the highest things, you'll find the best life has to offer. The blinders will be removed and you'll see those things. And life just somehow reorganizes itself around you as a result of what you're aiming at, especially when you're aiming at the highest things. Okay, so after this, you find yourself exhausted again and starved and parched, but you've united the multiplicity of the complexes and the archetypal spirits within, right? Those semi-autonomous partial personalities within your unconscious mind. So what happens? Again, the logos. You find a rock, right? And this is what happens in the story. The Israelites find a rock, and God tells Moses to strike the rock, and water will come out of it. And he does that, and water comes out of it. And of course, the rock is symbolic. Almost the majority of the time in the Bible, in particular, it's representative of the logos of the Christ. And so, in this case, the rock. The water coming from the rock is the Pneuma, the Geist coming from the Christ. And this happens multiple times, right? Multiple rocks, multiple flowing of the water, the nourishing, life-giving, infinite source of good. So now finally you make it to the edge of the promised land. But what's always at the edge? What's always at the margin? The monsters, right? The monsters, the hybrids. In this particular case, the giants. And again, the waters of the spirit, or the waters of death and new life, of potentiality.